What's up? What's up? What's up? This is your man, the STL Stranger, Umar Lee, here with Miranda Rectenwald, the co-host of this podcast for today. And we have two very special guests. We have our local St. Louis civil rights icon, Mr. Percy Green, and Harvard professor and author, Walter Johnson.
As a way to contrive to just get to meet Percy like a kind of a fanboy contrivance, I set up an event at Harvard called Generations of Struggle.
Percy, what was your experience at Harvard talking to the students? How well could they relate to the struggles of organizing in St. Louis? And
they probably knew more about myself than I did at the moment because so much I had forgotten,
Now, Walter, what first piqued your curiosity in St. Louis?
The thing that made me re-engage with Missouri was the uprising in Ferguson. I started with the political economy of Ferguson. I started with Emerson Electric right there on West Florissant Avenue, and the question of how is it that you can have a $26 billion a year corporation within the city limits of a place where we're farming poor black motorists for traffic tickets and people for wearing their pants too low and manner of walking in the roadway and having the grass too high and not taking your trash cans in after. And there's people that you meet in academia, and half of them have English accents and study German philosophy, and half of them talk like they're from Missouri.
Yeah.
I've always sort of proudly been the second half.
You must have read my jokes because I always talk about I always talk about the professors with the fake European accents.
Yeah, exactly. So,
but I want to ask you, as someone who's been involved in organizing the city of St. Louis for decades and generations, were you surprised to see this occur in St. Louis County in the suburb of Ferguson?
No, not really. And let me tell you the reason why. It's because the same elements that was there in Ferguson had always, they would exist here in St. Louis and all of the other areas where you had a number of blacks. And this was back either in the 60s or 70s, I can't remember. But one of the persons was handcuffed in the back of the police car and was shot and killed. There in Ferguson, the incident ignited like a keg of powder.
I noticed in your book was you emphasized this idea of St. Louis kind of being overlooked, and so I kind of wondered what maybe Walter, what you and Percy thought about like what would you say to somebody who's a young person in St. Louis on the north side who, what would you want them to know about St. Louis history?
History as of the South, where you had overt hanging of black folks as such. But I think St. Louis was pretty much doing the same thing to blacks, except that they were a little bit more sophisticated by way of utilizing their police department.
I think that the history of Black St. Louis is culturally rich, and it is radical, and it is basically covered up and not represented in the fabric of the city. And so, you could start with Francis McIntosh, who was lynched downtown, or you could start with Dred Scott.
Yeah.
But you'd have to talk about the Funston Nut Strike led by black women and communists.
I didn't even know anything about that. I mean, the McIntosh situation.
The idea of is St. Louis part of the North or part of the South, or is it part of the East or part of the West? It's trying to fit St. Louis into some other kind of pre-existing regional frame. And what I'm trying to argue is that St. Louis is actually the place that produced United States history. It's not. It's not that it was a part of this regional history of the United States. Is that a lot of it just came. It's like a new thing. It's a hub of the history of the United States.
And I think this whole St. Louis climate, Ferguson uprising, you had the first Tea Party rally in the nation was in St. Louis. Get James R. Ray coming out of the St. Louis area. His brother Jack owns a bar in South St. Louis. There's a lot of things that come out of St. Louis that affect America, both from a positive and a negative aspect. So when Walter writes a book about St. Louis, I think he's touching on something, because prior to Ferguson, when I was living in New York City and tell people I'm from St. Louis, they'd be like, "Oh, what are you, surrounded by cows or something?" People weren't paying attention to St. Louis,
Right.
and now I think they are.